This is the open Q&A session. I would like to ask all the referees that are going to speak today to activate your cameras, to be like present and open for questions coming from all the attendees. Thank you. So, are there questions? Now we have all the experts in a row here. And if there are not any questions, you can also try to just unmute yourself, ask your questions, and then we see.
Hi, one to Sebastian. One finalization or other hint is in the mobile app has a security topic, and the BSI from Germany, not the BSI from England, the Bundesamt für Security has launched a white paper for that. That's, I think, when you work with mobile apps, is a good hint to work with it, because there are not many security papers on the market now.
That is really true. So there is no dedicated standard that is directly applicable for medical and IVD medical devices. So therefore, we're trying to do the transfer of already established branch independent IT security standards, and to put that all together into a own guidance that we have published to fill this gap. However, BSI is providing as well a lot of guidance here, especially for CRITIS, for instance, so critical infrastructure. This is particularly true for huge diagnostic laboratories who need to fulfill those requirements. So in the end, it's the same as for all regulations. Under ISO 13485, you have the obligation to look into your role as a company and to see which regulations are to be applied. And in this case, IT security is a very heavy topic in the case of a connected device that is connected to a server system that is connected to the internet, that needs to fulfill the respective requirements for IT security. Sure.
I think we had a question that is quite interesting. I do not know whether everybody is following the chat, but that came related to Article 22 of the MDR and kitting for IVDs. I think we could also elaborate a little bit on this, because that is something important, I think. If you look through the IVDR and you look for how a kit is ruled or governed, you will be probably disappointed, because you won't find anything directly defining what it is and what you can put into it. So for this, you have to check out the MDR Article 22, because any IVD has first to fulfill the definition to be a medical device. So, and in the Article 22 of the MDR, you can see that there are possibilities to combine medical devices with IVDs, with other devices, as long as you still respect or still stay within the intended use, and that there is a clinical use of devices that are neither IVD or medical devices that you put together. So what I want to say with that is that the new regulations, this is one of the few things where you have more liberty under the new regulations that you have had before under the directives. I don't know whether some of the others wants to add something to this.
Yes, I'd like to add to this because we have a lot of customers that are asking for procedure pack for blood sampling. This refers as well to the question of Diana Ramirez: does self-sampling fall into the same category of self-testing? So first of all, independent of whether the patient does it him or herself, it is in the vast majority of cases, it's a combination of medical devices like the needle and combined with a sampling device for storage and shipment or conservation of the blood, for instance. These are IVDs, so there you have the combination. And to my opinion, Article 22 is here fully applicable because you have the combination and you have as well the packaging for shipment. So the biosafety packaging, which should be under the respective transport regulations for dangerous goods. So this is a third regulation that comes into play for such products, which is neither an IVD nor an MD. So therefore you have all three parts that are mentioned in Article 22 combined in one package, and this has an in vitro diagnostic purpose in general. However, it is combined from already CE marked and conform products, and this can be packed into a procedure pack under Article 22. And in the case that it is for self-sampling, it is very much dependent whether the user or the patient himself has to do something so that the term use is fulfilled. There is a particular guidance from the European Commission which refers to IVD directive. However, I think it is fully applicable for IVDR, in particular in compliance with Article 22. So as far as the user just simply puts the sample into a tube, like spitting into a tube for saliva samples, this would not be a self-testing device, because the test is performed by professionals in a laboratory if it's sent out to a laboratory. And if the report is clearly understood by a patient and gives a clear result, rather the software is then to be regarded separately.
If could I add something here, because it really depends on the type of sample and the type of sampling device. So I agree with Mr. Gröminger that if you don't do anything with the sample, so you don't have to prepare the sample in a way that, for example, you have to put it into another container, have an extraction, and then place it on the device. I agree. So. But we, for example, in the course of the COVID-19 testing, we had a lot of sampling devices for swabs for professional use, in fact. But as testing became more and more common, those were handed out to the lay user. So not a professional technician, but to a person who would do the sampling and then provide, as Mr. Gröminger explained, the tube where the swab was stored back to the laboratory. So that the test is done in a professional laboratory, but the sampling is done in the home environment, for example. It really depends what it is. So if it is, for example, if it is a swab or a lancing device or even a lancet, it needs to be considered that there might be a risk of harm to the patient. So this is considered this is really considered a medical device. So if it is a swab or a lancet, it still, under the regulations, will be considered medical devices with a specific risk. Depending on the intended purpose, it might have to be sterile, it might have to be free of nucleic acids or anything. So, but it's in the responsibility of the manufacturer to ensure that the classification is done appropriately. If you don't know where to put it, you can always ask your competent authority for help. And this was done in the course of the COVID-19 sampling devices that were placed on the market by some of the manufacturers. In fact, there were different answers from different competent authorities. So it is not only you to be confused, it's also the competent authorities confused where to put it, how to classify, and how to handle it in the end.
Yeah, exactly. So that was very helpful. Thank you for adding this. In the course of COVID-19, there was especially in the beginning, the professional users were, so to say, struggling with the risk of a potential infection by taking the sample from the mouth and from the stomach. So therefore, this is was critical in terms of risk-benefit analysis. So the idea was, so to say, to let the user, the patient, do the sampling themselves under instruction by a professional, and here is so to say the borderline to a self-testing device. Is it, as far as it is instructed by the professional, the professional can intervene in case of a wrong action by the patient, for instance, not going too deep into the throat by with the swab. This would still be, to my opinion, a professional use scenario, which just allows, with the instructions for use, that the lay user takes a few steps which are under control. But if it's fully uncontrolled, you need to have additional risk mitigation measures to avoid false negative results, because false negative results in this case would have severe effects which are considered by the IVDR but not by the IVDD, because a false negative result of COVID-19 just by not putting the swab deep enough into the throat would lead to spread of a disease that is highly infectious and life-threatening. So here you have all criteria of Rule 1 fulfilled. Yeah. So this is a very good example why an up-classification of uncritical products under IVDD, say uncritical, is then up-classified maybe up to the highest class under IVDR.
Another point on this, because it's topical at the moment, is I know one competent authority is really expecting, if it is for finger stick collection and for self-testing, then the Lancet must be of the type that's approved for self-testing. That has been designed for self-testing. You just can't throw any Lancet in that collection kit also.
It needs to be safety Lancets. Oh.
That's what Michael said when referring to Article 22. It must be fully in line with the intended use. Absolutely. And if very often we have in the IVD field intended use or instructions for use that do not clearly show is it for professional or not. And that is just the lack of supervision by notified bodies, because nobody looks at it, only the manufacturer.
In this whole discussion, there was briefly also discussed the aspect of transport of samples. And you need to be aware that there are national rulings in each country in Europe about how to transport those kind of biohazard substances. For example, in Switzerland, there's a whole set of ruling that is, I mean, all those rules are more or less comparable one to the other with the different countries, but there is not one fits all. So those that want to provide distance testing and that are confronted to this sampling transport have to think about national rules. And if you want to cross borders, it turns out to be a nightmare. Be careful with that.
There was a question regarding the software from Birgit Weisenböck concerning feature updates and bug fixes. I'd like to answer that question. So in the case that your software is changed and you just do bug fixes or security patches, this would certainly, in the case that you do not change the specifications of your software, so the software is because of the bug not doing as not performing as specified, you can do the bug fixing without involving the notified body, to my opinion, but Sabine Ose can state on this as well, certainly, what the notified body position is here. As far as you have feature updates, you add a new specification, and as soon as you add a specification or change a specification, you need to look whether this is a substantial change or not, according to the substantial change guidances of the notified bodies. So therefore, I clearly recommend, as soon as you change specifications, check this and then decide whether there's a need to report or even ask the notified body in case of doubts.
I think it would be essential, in case you plan to implement a significant change, that first you get in contact with your notified body and inform them on the planned change, so that there is no wrong work or not too much work used within the manufacturer, and also to get that approval that you can potentially implement the change. Because sometimes the notified body would disagree, depending on the purpose and depending on the risk.
Thank you for adding this.
Thank you.
Please feel free to unmute yourself and just ask your question.
There was a private question to me from somebody with the abbreviated with RS. What if the system can be used a variable as aid to diagnostics, but there are some publications which with specific use, clinical use, but this is not wanted to be claimed intended use. So if I could add to that, there is a statement in the IVDR that clearly says the classification is independent of aid in diagnosis. So it's phrased differently. They say primary test, secondary test, or tests to add to add a diagnosis, so which is the aid in diagnosis claim. So that means you independently of the claim aid in diagnosis, you need to classify it respectively. So for instance, if you have a genetic test that is used for aid in diagnostics to help the physician to decide based on all other clinical evidence for one single patient to decide what to do, for instance, which treatment to use, then it clearly falls on the class C, even if it's only a light aid in the decision making, but it is per se falling under class C as a genetic test, and for cancer these are the two critical aspects of such a intended use.
Sebastian, there is one more question in the general chat from Andreas Oberleitner. Can you see that? How would you classify a software pipeline used in next generation sequencing for gene variant detection?
Yeah, for sure, gene variant detection. So that the problem is that a genetic test is not specified. So there's no definition of a genetic test in the IVDR. So what I'm actually using is to use the German law for genetic testing, because that has a definition. So there they call it genetische Untersuchung. And this genetic investigation is, to me, always a gene test which is classified in class C. So if you're looking for variants, for instance, somatic mutations, then it's clearly a gene test, no matter what what the clinical claim is. If you say this is the example is breast cancer, and breast cancer is for sure cancer diagnostics, even if it's aid in diagnostics, so that's in the same line as the question before, it would fall under class C. You just need to exclude class D, but class D is for infectious diseases, so you can easily decide if you look into infectious genetic testing, then you need to see whether this is detection or quantification. So even then you may have the chance to get down to class C, but any genetic test will certainly fall at least on the class C. Does that answer your question, Mr. Oberleitner?
I agree
yes,
with the high
thank you.
classification of those genetic testing devices.
Yeah, but
That
you
whole-
need to be sure that there can be parts of the software which are not in the high class. So in high classes, for instance, if you have part of the software that are transferring the data from the raw data into FASTQ files, and even the sorting of those sequences to or the alignment of the sequences to the human genome or to any other genome is not per se a critical clinical claim. So this can be a generic part of the software, and then the algorithm which clearly allows to assess the sample with regard to the clinical question. This is the critical part, and this can be as a module up classified, whereas the other parts of this pipeline can be down classified. Maybe possible in class A or in class B via rule 6 if nothing else applies. Epigenetic tests as biomarkers, I can state on that. Yeah, I mean, epigenetics, you see here is the difficulty again with what is genetic testing. I mean, epigenetics can be part of genetics, but as it is not so to say directly in the genetic code, I would say there is a way to argue against it, and then rather find out what is the criticality. So you see, genetic tests can be everything, but a genetic test for the prognosis of cancer or development of a disease, patient management, so on and so forth, is certainly always something that can be critical. So ask yourself or ask your team, and especially the clinical experts, whether they think that the conclusive result for the patient is bearing a life-threatening condition. If that is the case, so not in each probability. So you need to find an acceptance criteria of the probability to get rid of the problem that Michael earlier showed us. As soon as there is a very low probability that the patient comes into a life-threatening condition directly with that result, you have the chance to down classify to class B. But any genetic test would at least fall, if it provides a result to the patient, it would at least fall on the class B, and most of those epigenetic tests will fall on the class C because they bear a life-threatening condition for a single patient. But they will never bear a risk for several patients, so therefore you can exclude class D.
Can I just put a little bit of extra thought into that? It also, we have to think about the clinical purpose again too.
Exactly.
So what's the epigenetic test for?
Exactly.
And that will drive the function. That will drive the classification as well. So I mean, it's as Sabine said earlier, you know, just the fact you've got an epigenetic marker, that's only part of the story. It's really what you're using it for that drives the classification. And I think we have to remember that.
Yeah. I mean, this goes a little, oh, sorry.
In fact, I just wanted to add that this makes the difference between the method and the intended purposes of the device that is put on the market. So we have to keep this in mind when making the classification of the device.
Yeah. And I think it's, like I said in my talk, I mean, aid to diagnosis or an absolute diagnosis, that affects the type of studies you do and the level of clinical evidence. It doesn't necessarily impact on the class.
I think this gives partly also an answer to the question of Nina Wozniak related to grouping devices of similar products in groups or generic device groups to ease the process. I mean, the grouping in the field of IVD has something directly to do with the method and the intended use. Because if either of the two is slightly different, you will have a problem with grouping devices. It might be more difficult in the field of IVD for this sampling and for the notified body to decide to sample on what than it would be for classical medical devices. But maybe Sabine can have a word on that with the sampling for review of IVD devices.
Yes, I can. It's if you look into Annex 7 of the IVDR, this is very special to the IVDR for in vitro diagnostic devices. So it was very clear for the medical device directive already that if you have a lot of products, the notified body had to group them and then select samples of those products that are mentioned on a certificate to have regular reviews of the technical file. So to understand that the products that are on a certificate fulfill the requirements, because not all, of course, if you look on, if you see certificates, you will find manufacturers having a range of 500, 700, 1,500 products. Of course, the notified body does not look at or cannot look at each and every individual technical file. So depending on the rules and depending on the risk, the notified body has to establish a system to sample the technical files, and that is done differently for Class D, for Class B and Class C devices. Any Class D device technical file has to be scrutinized by the notified body, but for Class C and Class B devices, we have to establish a sampling plan, which will not be laid open to the manufacturer. So there will be a surprise every year when the notified body comes up with a request to submit a technical file within a certain amount of time, assuming that products that are listed on a certificate have an up-to-date technical file, including all necessary information to provide compliance with the respective applicable requirements of the regulation. So what we do here is, together with the manufacturer, look at the list of products, group that list of products in accordance with the NBOC codes, for example, and for some other products, we would group them according to technology or intended use. This really depends on the manufacturer and their suggestion. So we can agree or we cannot agree, but this will be part of the application process. And I would really love to add something here to what is called genetic testing. It's in the regulation. And at the beginning, when all of the comments were requested by the interested parties, there was a lot of back and fro regarding genetic testing. There were comments saying that genetic testing is not a purpose, it's a method. So you can use a lot of things to be done to do genetic testing. The intention of the Commission was to avoid risks related to samples being sent outside the European Union for testing and the results coming back without a clinician or a medical doctor having had a look at it. It was so easy. You see, a sampling device was provided, a hair, saliva was provided and then submitted to a laboratory outside of the European Union. The results were sent back to the person sending in the sample. And that was considered a very high risk because nobody knew what the results would be or how the results would be interpreted. This was mainly for paternity testing, but still there was other tests, or there were other tests provided in the market that were considered of high risk. So this leaves a lot of questions open, and there is a working group implemented to discuss guidance here. So at this time, I can only state, please look at the wording very closely, at the wording in the regulation, and do as the regulation says. And if you classify, give the reasons how and why you classified in this way, depending on the intended purpose. It's like a prayer in church. It's intended purpose and intended purpose and intended purpose. And this is how you classify, and this is how you you set and define your justification in your technical documentation for the risk classification. This needs to be provided to the notified body. This is also the same today, and the notified body has the opportunity to agree or to disagree. In case of disagreement, you would have to seek guidance by the competent authority.
Thank you. But this part, genetic, this is related to directed to consumer testing. This is regarded in Article 4, genetic information counseling and informed consent, and this is addressed to the member states, because there the IVDR states that the member states shall ensure that the genetic tests used on individuals shall have respective counseling and informed consent according to the German gene diagnostics law. So this is something the member states have to rule out, and in Germany this is ruled out very good in a very good way with the gene diagnostics law. And for the manufacturer, it is rather important to describe that, as you say, in the intended use, whether there is a criticality for the patient in case of a wrong result, and in case of you need to have positive and negative predictive values, so and these need to be displayed in a way that an individual, a lay user, can understand it. So here the usability comes into play, and summative evaluation, even of understanding the result, needs to be performed in a summative evaluation study. At least in my opinion, this is the way when we should go in such cases.
I think also, just to add in on the genetics tests and the origin of that in the IVDR, I know that 10 years ago I was helping a group called Eurogentest, which was the European Union funded organization of genetic labs around Europe, put together a submission to the EU, to the Commission, regarding the regulation. And a lot of the concerns were around the fact that there were many new biomarkers and many new mutations, and a lot of tests out there without any scientific validity and also without any clinical performance evidence. And so I think part of the regulation was to enforce that bit. But that is, so it doesn't matter whether, regardless of the definition of a genetic test, I think we have to remember, whatever the test is, as Sabine said, you know, we need clinical evidence, we need scientific validity, we need analytical performance, and we need clinical performance, regardless of the classification. The classification does help decide the level of clinical evidence, but really its main use is around your submissions to the notified body. I see there's a question around orphan diseases and level of clinical, how you get enough clinical evidence together when you have a rare disease or an orphan disease. And this is a question I get asked quite often. I think you have to really work closely again with your notified body, but also with the clinicians. And of course, with rare diseases, they are rare. You're not going to be able to have something which has confidence intervals that are so tight that incredibly robust. But we must remember, within the regulation, we have a requirement to consider post-market performance. And this is one way you can also gather evidence. And I think it's around, for a rare disease, you will not be able to have the same level of confidence in the result until you've gained experience in the field. And so it's again around the information you put into your instructions for use and around interpretation of the results, where you have only been able to perform limited studies. You must also therefore ensure that whoever interprets that result realizes they can't have the same level of confidence as if you'd tested 5,000 of a population with that mutation or with that disease. But then you must bring into play your plan, have a plan that's well set out, that's been agreed by your notified body, and actions that follow up to get that post-market performance follow-up. The thing with rare diseases is you usually know where your test is going, because there aren't many labs around the world that are going to use it. So you can have a close, and we are told you must be proactive in your post-market approach. And so I think here you can work with the labs that your test is going in to collect high quality post-market data. And that can be part of your plan and part of your post-market activities to gather more evidence of the ongoing performance of your product. And so I think, that again, would have to be done in close cohorts with your notified body, your agreement on the plan, on the level of evidence that is feasible to collect, because the benefit, as we know, you can do more harm by not putting a test out there. As long as you have a level of confidence that it will work well enough, and that provided the interpretation of the results doesn't give anyone the false idea that the test can be 100, you can have 100% faith in that test. So I think there are ways to dealing with orphan diseases and rare diseases, and we're seeing, I get lots of these questions all the time, but I talk about having a really effective post-market performance follow-up plan in place and having that agreed with your notified body. Would anyone else like to comment on that question?
Yeah, sure.
I think.
Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry, Robin. Just to add to what you said, I think that as well, the scientific validity for those analytes, which allows you to detect some of the orphan disease, in this case, have to be you have to have a strong scientific validity on tests as well.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Also, what you can do, it depends also what kind of test we are speaking about and what kind of gold standard for diagnosis is available to look for eventually the possibility of having also some kind of retrospective validation adding to the scientific background for those tests.
To my opinion here, the Article 5 comes into play for which allows the healthcare providers, so the laboratories, to develop lab-developed tests without a CE mark for their own purposes. So my question would be to the group and to the audience, whether you think it is feasible to go for performance evaluation approach until you have sufficient evidence, and to collaborate with respective laboratories that claim this as a laboratory developed test according to Article 5.5 until you have the respective clinical evidence to CE mark it.
You can only do that in one lab though, because you can't share the test. So for me, I don't think that's a pathway, and for a lab developed test still have to meet the GSPRs. So I think this is the issue, whether it's lab developed or a commercial assay, you have to meet.
Yeah, but it doesn't show, but it doesn't need to show the clinical performance.
No, but the Article 5 is not linked to orphan. That is not the right approach to deal with that. Maybe
to my opinion,
Misha,
the Article 5 is exactly for that purpose. For rare diseases, the laboratories have the option to only fulfill Annex 1 and not to fulfill, I mean, there are several other things they need to fulfill. So this is, so to say, the small version of the IVDR for laboratories. However, to my opinion, it is exactly to avoid that for rare diseases, weak tests are CE marked. So the level of evidence need to be first created by laboratories which have those rare disease testings under tight control, and that a product, a CE marked IVD product, can only be placed on the market after having sufficient experience from routine laboratory data, which is exactly one way of the options to create the clinical data outlined in Annex 10. So therefore, there must be the option to gain information from medical laboratories, because otherwise you will not have clinical data.
Except how do you, I mean, the fact is that a lab developed test is just within that one laboratory or laboratory group.
If you provide just simply the reagents without a medical purpose, the laboratory can develop their own test procedure, which is then, so to say, the controlled version in a single laboratory by using reagents that are not claimed to fall under the IVDR because they don't have yet a clinical claim. And if manufacturers work together with laboratories, I do see an option to fulfill both interests from laboratories as well as from manufacturers.
I think that would help create the data for the evidence for scientific validity. I don't think it's going to support clinical performance so much.
The thing is the step to commercialize tests.
That this can be used, that these data from routine laboratories can be used for clinical for clinical evidence. So
it's
therefore,
one source of data.
What would be the plus then by comparing to undertaken as a legal manufacturer, conducting your own clinical studies in collaboration with university hospitals, for instance? I don't see what it will bring to go through the Article 5 in this case, where you will be only using one lab.
If you want to end up in a commercial test, I think the pathway is not really the one to use, because it will probably take a long time.
Certainly not for the manufacturer, but in collaboration with the laboratory, the manufacturer can gain the clinical data from a laboratory that is working according to Article 5.
I think that the term "the clinical data" that is maybe a little bit misleading. They can get part of clinical data or some inputs, but not the clinical data that would allow you to put a CE mark on your device and commercialize it. I mean, that is the big difference, and this is why I said it's probably not the right approach and the right way to do it. It can be one part in the development, but it cannot be the part and the data.
Yeah, I mean, for rare diseases, or orphan diseases, this is maybe the only source.
I think it has to be under a more controlled way. I still think it's always difficult, this question, because it depends how rare the rare disease is, how many labs there are, and how much you as the manufacturer can control the data coming in or whatever. I still think I would prefer to rely on having sufficient data to make some sort of claim, and even as you say, it may be weaker, but then you really need that counteracted against the benefits and the risks of not having the test, and then having really well-defined, agreed post-market follow-up studies with the labs that are doing these tests for rare diseases, because there won't be many labs doing the test. Personally, I just feel that way you get, because you're going to need to have confidence in those results.
I mean, we saw it, but it's not directly the same. It's not directly the same issue. However, it's a little bit comparable. When you see what happened with the COVID and the COVID tests that popped up like mushrooms, everywhere, everybody wanted to do a COVID test. And you also see that there have been some exceptional tests granted in the US, but also in Europe on a nationally basis. And when then you got the first data, and when then competent authorities started to dig into the results, many of those just disappeared again. Because I mean, that was the problem of the rare test, not the rare disease, but the rare test that was available. But it's the same issue. I mean, if you do that, it can end up to that you then find quickly out that it does simply not work. It's simply not good results in the end. So the statistics should not be cheated. And
But
the
on
way
the
No, I don't
getting
agree.
data
I
should
mean,
not
I
be
do
cheated.
agree with that, Michael. Absolutely, you shouldn't cheat the statistics. You should be frank about them, and put you need to ameliorate where you can't get the strongest statistics.
Yeah.
And agree
on
with your notified body how you do that.
Yeah, I would like to add something here, just to put the question of the COVID tests back to the experience we encountered in the first steps. Of course, it was well known, I think, to manufacturers and designers of IVDs that there is something coming up, and they were aware of the situation of a new RNA virus with high risk. And there were many manufacturers, and we all know them, who were already prepared when the pandemic hit. So these tests did not, these tests did not pop up like mushrooms, because the manufacturers knew upfront, and they really looked, and as Robin said, they did an appropriate market surveillance. They scanned the available information on what was there and what was found and where it was found. So there were at least 3 or 4 manufacturers in Germany actually knowing what it was and actually preparing very good tests to address at least the NAT tests went well. So now we are facing problems with the immunological tests, but the direct molecular biology tests, they seemed to be working. But as it is, and I really want to make that point here, the information on the type of the virus, the way of infection, got in quickly. There were other viruses or other diseases where this information only came in very, very slowly. And if I remember, the first HIV tests, the first generation HIV tests, you would not be able to place them on the market right now because they are not fulfilling the common specifications. And in case of such very dangerous and high risk infections, the Commission is always thinking of common specifications for this type of test, just to ensure that manufacturers are forced to have a minimum level of data collected. And and in fact, we received applications on COVID-19 self-tests, lay user tests, and it was a quite critical situation. Do you say no? Although as a notified body, although these tests might be needed, or do you say, yes, we accept that application and let us look into the data? And in fact, the data was horrible, I can tell you. So we declined the application, and the manufacturer is now doing a sophisticated review and doing a consistent lay user study. And as you may be aware, there have been new common specifications or technical specifications published for HIV and HCV lay user tests, which is, and you can see that this is a concern of the European Commission, that the lay user, the application or the intended use for the lay user shall be confirmed and verified by the manufacturer. So it's really up to you as the manufacturer to identify the potential risk and not say, oh, it's better than nothing, because there might be problems if you don't.
I mean, I can only agree with what you say, Sabine. We have seen really many, I mean, Sylvia maybe can state on that, many tests that they came to us, manufacturers, we need to make quickly a CE mark and have a look on the data, or we want to benefit from this exception program in France or in Germany. And when we saw the data, we had to tell them basically, I mean, forget it. I mean, maybe Sylvia, you want to add a word on that?
Well, it's true that we have seen many of those tests which were for self-certification in Europe, COVID tests, not only on serological. Indeed, there are some issues of false positive and negative with it, but also the nucleic acid tests and the data that we obtained was just awful in terms of clinical performance, which was done on population or on samples which were not with no characterization, and also the analytical performance where you didn't have any information either on cross-reactivity or interference. So the data available for those tests, as you said, probably the post-market surveillance of those manufacturers was good, and they know that those tests are coming on the market and they were preparing it. But anyhow, the data that we observe is not clearly at the level that is expected. Basically, if those tests are to go right now by a notified body, I'm not sure that they will succeed.
This again comes down to level of evidence and the claims you can make. You know, like a lot of the initial antibody tests, you know, like didn't have a very clearly defined, for COVID, didn't have a very clearly defined intended purpose, you know, where they, or what I call the diagnostic use case. Is it for diagnosis? Is it an aid for diagnosis? Is it for surveillance? And the level of evidence you need for each can differ quite greatly. And so going back to the rare, my comments are about the rare disease program. If you know, you can't say that something, if you have a rare disease and your confidence intervals are quite wide, there's no way you can confidently say this can be used for diagnosis of. It can be used with and you can put around it as an aid for diagnosis with other, but it must be used in this context. So I think this is where level of clinical evidence is important to consider when you define your intended use statement. And if you don't have the level of evidence to make a claim for diagnosis, don't make the claim. Think about what else you can use it for.
This is also a question of strategy. Start by doing the intended use of your test based on the evidence that you can have, and collect the data if you are going for aid to diagnosis and your ultimate aim is to go on screening. Well, start by going with the aid as the diagnosis, and during your post-market surveillance phase, you may adapt and you may collect data for screening afterwards. But we need legal manufacturers need to be also smart in the way they are making their intended use and proposes.
Are there more questions from the audience?
Sabine, I would like to ask you a question concerning the OEM products.
Mm-hmm.
How are you handling the technical documentation in cases where the legal manufacturer, in fact, it's supplying its product from an OEM?
Yeah. So what is your exact question? Because this is a very wide field.
Yes, so in terms of the technical documentation, most of the time those legal manufacturers do not have much in their technical documentation, because how it's handled, is it a contract, a quality agreement between the legal manufacturer and the supplier, this critical supplier, where a part of the technical documentation can be provided to the auditors from the notified body by the manufacturer, would be considered as sufficient?
No, it's not. So in accordance with what is documented in the regulation, the technical file, so if you are the legal manufacturer, let's start from that point. You are the legal manufacturer, but you are the virtual manufacturer. You don't have ideas of the design of the product. You don't know how to manufacture the product, but you have very good partners doing that for you under corresponding contractual agreements. So who knows a problem, or who would be able to trace a problem to the device if something bad happens? So there is an agreement between there is an agreement between the OEM, so the original manufacturer, and the legal manufacturer, the PLM, for support. But under the regulation, you have as the legal manufacturer. So if you put your name on it and you register in EUDAMED this product, you have to have access to that technical file, meaning the full technical file according to Annex 2, and meaning that the data needs to be there in your hands. You have to be able to provide that technical file to the competent authority once they come on site every day. It's not that it's not enough at this time. It's not enough to have it available upon request for the notified body only, for their eyes only. You as the legal manufacturer are obligated to hold that technical file. I'm aware that a lot of legal counsel is working to find a solution, because that of course in a technical file there is all of that intellectual property which the OEM does not want to share. So it's
This,
yeah.
sorry,
I wanted just to add to this point. There is some guidance out. There was a guidance from the MHRA about virtual manufacturing, and the thing is the following: we are focusing too much on having the technical documentation. What does having? Having does mean nothing. The legal manufacturer on the label has to master his product, because he has to run post-market surveillance, post-market clinical follow-up for his product. So if you do not have full control of your product, you are unable to do so.
It's true.
This is why a legal manufacturer it's his technical documentation. Whether this product is produced elsewhere or not, that does not matter. It's then a supplier, a contract manufacturer that is doing that, but the responsibility for the product ultimately is with the manufacturer. And in this context, what is I think really, really important for everybody, also related to those transition periods, is to get familiarized with the definitions of what does mean what does mean manufacturer. There is no legal manufacturer defined, it's manufacturer. And what is placing on the market, what is making available on the market, and what means putting into service. This is crucial for this entire discussion. And I would like to share the link to the Blue Guide in the chat. You should have a look into the Blue Guide related to those definitions, and also related to what the manufacturer means, in fact, in addition to what is the definition of the IVDR or the MDR. Because in fact, the so-called private labeling or virtual manufacturing, that it's just wording. It does not really exist. You are on the label, you are the manufacturer, and you have the full responsibility.
Correct. I always explain it to manufacturers: when you have the little manufacturer symbol and your name is next to it, you are the responsible party,
Yeah,
and not your OEM. And you have to know everything about your product. It's true.
There's no possibility to claim this aspect about production I'm not aware of. There may be some more clear guidance eventually coming out one day on that, because the MDR and the IVDR in Annex 2 and also in one of the articles, I do not remember the number, it is stated the technical documentation or a summary thereof, and it's missing the definition of what is the summary thereof, and it is also missing a clear clarification what the or means. So for the moment, the reading of the regulation is you need to have you need to master the technical documentation, And this little annex or the summary thereof, nobody speaks about that. And this requires some clarification, I think. Maybe one day we will get one.
Additionally, there is the problem of what about components in a kit, for instance. So I just have actually a customer question that I cannot really answer is for instance, a lysis buffer for a particular body fluid allowing to access nucleic acids. They have been using such a commercial CE marked product, but it is available in too large volumes for the applicability of that particular kit. They don't have access to that technical file, and they will not get this certainly. But what about taking this particular part into the product as a black box component without having the technical details of that part? What do you think, Sabine? Your opinion would be very interesting how to handle such a particular case.
It's really, I would like to answer as an auditor. It really depends. It's always we are facing these questions quite frequently. What do we do? Do you remember the case where the Supreme Court in Germany has ruled that a specific conformity assessment procedure was required for an importer in Germany who imported CE labeled product for lay use from Spain, not having German instructions for use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they just put a German instruction for use inside.
Mm-hmm.
So that was all they did. But there was a big, and of course the original manufacturer took this party to court, and there is a European regulation for ensuring to ensure that the distributor takes care that legal requirements are fulfilled. So for products entering Germany for lay use, a German instruction for use is required. So the distributor said, okay, I'm importing this device from Spain and I'm the distributor, and under the European regulation and German regulation, I just add a German instruction for use. And this is now specifically covered in the regulation. So if you do such thing, if you're an importer or distributor and you change anything to the product, which is the same as repacking, this is also mentioned, then you have to have procedures in place. This does not mean you become the manufacturer.
So,
Yeah,
I mean,
Michael?
This is related to Article 16.
Yes.
Of MDR and of IVDR,
yes.
And there is a lot of clarification still needed related
yes.
to this Article 16. I have been continuing asking Commission services for more than a year to get clarification about Article 16 related to the certification requirement in there. And I think it's the team NB now that is working on something to give an input back to Brussels on how this should be handled. The thing with your problem with the big bulk that has CE and you want to repackage is really to assess Article 16 and to find a way to do a kind of repackaging of the big volume under rulings with Article 16, or get a contract in place with the original manufacturer to get a special packaging with a smaller volume. But and then having a CE mark readily available, and then you just kit it and do not need to have then the technical documentation accessible.
Let me give you an example. What I experienced during one of the audits. There was a very inventive manufacturer who put together a kit with little sterile needles and a blood glucose measuring system. The sterile needles came in a big box, protected, and then they took the individual needle and assembled it into another box. But what happened during transportation was that the packaging of the sterile needle was insufficient, and the needle just stuck through the paper. So it was not sterile anymore. and this is something that you cannot know when you just disassemble a validated packaging system. So it really needs to be looked at depending on the risk and depending on the type of product that you are repackaging. Does that make sense?
That's exactly my opinion. Yeah, it is just a complicated case, which is, so to say, somewhere in between a manufacturing step. Yeah, so is aliquoting of a liquid, a buffer liquid that is uncritical, which is just aseptic and not sterile. So how much is that critical in terms of repacking or aliquoting into smaller volume packages? But I see, I'm completely in line with you to go back to the original manufacturer and discuss the criticality with them and discuss the options they have, whether they pack it in a variant which they can deliver, or whether the new manufacturer shall do that in his own responsibility, and thereby claiming this part of the product as a reconfigured product under Article 16. That could be possible.
Yeah.
Or search for another supplier who is willing to give the details.
Sebastian, if you want to do a funny thing, you go Article 16 and you ask Sabine whether she comes to certify the quality system under Article 16.
Yeah, we will do that. we are prepared. We are prepared to do that for the.
But what certificate are you delivering then?
Yeah, it's still it's still under discussion between the notified bodies, so it's not that easy. But we all realize that the notified bodies, the notified bodies in that group all hold an accreditation according to ISO 13485. So no worries at that time, at that point. But still, it needs to be agreed with the Commission that this is going to be the acceptable solution, because I think they did not look at that from the practical point of view.
That's for sure.
Herr Grömminger, I would like to if there is the time, for repackaging, that's a different story. But if you are receiving a bulk and you are filling into smaller vials, I would say this is clearly a manufacturing step. And you would require validation of the filling, you would have to do stability studies and all of that. So that would be quite a huge topic if you come across something like this in an audit.
Yeah, that's exactly my opinion. I recommended the respective manufacturer to search for another one, and I found one who is actually certified by you under 13485. So actually,
lovely. Yeah, great.
This
Good to
shouldn't
know.
be a problem.
Okay.
So are there more questions from the audience?
Importers and there is one question. Do importers and distributors also get audits? I can clearly say yes.
What is very interesting, or I can just cite experiences that we have with the MDR until this point, related to the distribution chain. But one thing is clear: you will have to deal your distributors with the distributors like if it would be suppliers or subcontractors, because you will have, as a manufacturer, to ensure that your distributors are able to handle the products. And with IVDR, this will be even worse than with MDR, because IVDs often have very specific storage temperatures, storage conditions that hardware MDR devices won't have. And you will have to ensure that your distribution chain is able to guarantee the +5 to +15 degrees throughout this distribution chain. And if you do not qualify them correctly, you will have a problem, because notified bodies, they will have to dig into that.
Yeah, we'll have to ensure. Yes, it's true. But this is something that is usually part of the distributor contract. And during the past years, we have always looked into distribution contracts, because we feel that this is a critical service supplier to the manufacturer, and specific regulations have to be in place related to warehousing, archiving of records, traceability, the information provided to the users in around the distributor. So their responsibility has to be clearly stated, and also the limitation of that responsibility has to be clearly stated in the contract. So there should be no surprises for all of those manufacturers that are undergoing regular audits by notified bodies or accredited ISO 13485 notified bodies, because under 13485 2016 we had looked or we had to look into all of these quality agreements.
I mean, the agreement is one thing.
Yeah.
You tend to go there and verify. And
yes, it's true.
I had cases where there was distributor agreement signed, everything not a problem. And if you go actually on site and you check the warehouse, you enter in summer warehouse where there is 35 degrees in it, and the devices are labeled 5 to 15 degrees.
Do you remember one of our inspections where we found a bird's nest in the warehouse?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So Diana is asking, in Michael's example, would the temperature need to be 24/7 recorded?
No, I mean, that's a matter of validation. If you have validated that it cannot be over that temperature with other measures, there is no reason to do that 24/7. However, to be really sure, this can be a very good option with a good system that that tracks the data and sends you SMS at every time at the day, that you know when the system is exceeding the specified temperatures.
And those measurements do not need to happen every second. I mean, this is always a question. This is basic physics behind how fast can something heat up. So there is devices existing that you can validate where you get a measurement point done every 5 minutes, and as soon as there is an alarm limit reached, you get an SMS, and then you can cope with the situation. So before you have the action limit.
So there is another question from Robert. What about secondary traders? For example, sales to wholesale, then selling further to pharmacy.
They are all part of the distribution chain, no? And if in the contract with the first tier distributor, you have to specify what happens if there are second and third tier distributors in. So any requirement that you have directly with your distributor needs then to be reported further down the chain. And many manufacturers, they exclude that there are sub-tier distributors, or they want to know about that.
And Michael, it's Robin, further to that, if we go to the definition of distributor in the regulation, it says any legal or natural person in the supply chain, other than the manufacturer or the importer, that makes a device available on the market up until the point of putting into service.
So exactly this covers everything.
Exactly.
Oh, I think of the Booth and the Rossmanns in Germany. Any more questions?
Yeah, even this is a problem for software and apps. Even Amazon and yeah, Google Play, as well as Apple App Store, they are discussing about whether they are economic operators in that case for medical device software. So this is covered as well.
Further questions? If not, then I would proceed to the event closing.
Maybe there's just one from Robert Moldenauer. Is it necessary to check pharmacy? I think the pharmacy is part of the distribution chain, but pharmacy is a little bit special because for dealing or for handling pharmaceuticals, you anyway need a GMP or a good distribution practice, GDP certification in your national right, so under national law, and this covers the chain of cold, for example, and the handling of these kind of products. So if your distribution chain is pharmacies, it's much easier to get contracts set up with those, and you can because of these national good distribution practice certifications that they have, you can be quite or pretty sure about good conditions to handle a product.
So there's more. if an IVD medical device is established for professional use only and this label wants to be removed, is this considered a major change?
Who wants to reply? Otherwise I can.
I can do as well. So if you're aiming to sell the product now to lay users, then for sure this is a major change because you change the intended use. Because part of the intended use is as well the intended users. I would even go beyond that. I would say if you change for professional use from professional laboratory stuff to healthcare professionals in a hospital or in a hostel for elderly people, this is kind of different and is a major change dependent on the design of the product and what the intended use is of the product. Sabine, do you agree?
Yes, I do. So if you just remove it and you don't replace it by a description of the foreseen user group, it will be a major nonconformity against Annex 2. Because you really have to specify in the intended use or the intended purpose the user group that the product is intended to be used by. So if you just remove the professional user, then you are not in compliance with the regulation any longer.
And we need to add that the IVDR differentiates between point of care,
Yes.
which the IVDD didn't. There we just had the difference between professional use and self-testing, and now we have the three different levels: professional use, point of need, point of care, and lay user. There are different or particular requirements for usability for point of care testing under Annex 1.
Exactly.
Okay, if there are no more questions.
Thank
Perfect.
you.
So at the end, I would like to thank the speakers very much for their time and for the presentations and for willing to discuss all the questions that we had here today. And also I would like to thank the audience for attending actually, and hopefully most, if not all, of your questions were answered today. And we will get back to you in a few or couple of days when we had access to the PowerPoint presentations, and we'll make them available for you. So at the end of the day, I would like to thank you all and wish you a great afternoon.